Okay, so welcome to another deep dive, and today we're taking a look at Google.
Google.
Yeah, and this one came from you, dear listener. You asked us to dig into this.
Absolutely.
And we've got quite a spread of sources here. We've got Google's Wikipedia entry, of course. There's a great article from This Street that looks at kind of their journey beyond 2019. And History Cooperative had a really fascinating piece that asks, who invented Google?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
It's one that has a fascinating answer that is more than just two guys in a garage, which we'll get to, but there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, and I guess our mission here with this deep dive is to synthesize all this into something that's both clear and engaging.
Right.
Hit those aha moments.
Hit those aha moments without overloading you with too much information.
Yeah, right.
So, let's unpack this beast. Let's get into it.
Let's start at the very beginning.
Okay, the beginning.
So back in 1996, there's this project at Stanford University. Called Backrub.
Backrub.
And it was started by two PhD students, Larry Page and Sergey Brin.
The dynamic duo.
Right.
Yeah.
And their goal was to kind of look at the World Wide Web's link structure, almost like a massive graph.
Right. Treat the web as a graph.
Yeah.
As nodes and edges, connections, what's connected to what.
And this is where, like, Page's PhD supervisor, Terry Winograd, really encouraged him to go down this path. And later on, Page said, this is the best advice I ever got.
Yeah.
And the core idea here was that the more backlinks a web page has, and the nature of those backlinks kind of indicates its importance. It's like how in academia, the papers that are cited a lot are seen as influential.
Right, exactly. It's like a validation, right? A kind of a peer review on the web, not from humans, but from other websites.
Yeah.
And that's the fascinating part is they saw this structure that was inherent in the web that at that time really nobody was paying attention to, I don't think.
Yeah, and we should mention, along with Page and Brin, there were some other key collaborators.
Oh yeah.
So Scott Hassan, he was the lead programmer.
He was, some people even say he was like an unofficial third founder.
Right.
But he didn't stick around. He went off and did some other stuff.
Cool.
But yeah, he wrote a lot of the early code. He was hugely important in the early days.
Yeah.
And Alan Sterenberg also provided some crucial implementation help. So there's a whole team of people, even though we think of it as Page and Brin.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people involved.
And it's always interesting to me, like, to see how the project got its initial momentum.
Right.
So Brin's work, for example, was supported by a National Science Foundation graduate fellowship.
Okay, yeah, so there's some legitimacy there. It's not just some crazy idea they're working on in their dorm room.
Yeah, and both Page and Brin were part of this Stanford computer science research team that was funded by this thing called Massive Digital Data Systems, MDDS.
MDDS, yeah.
And this is where it gets kind of interesting. So MDDS had connections to the CIA and the NSA through intelligence and military contractors.
That's interesting. It's interesting. I mean, so, the military and the intelligence agencies are often at the forefront of a lot of research and a lot of funding of research. So this shouldn't be entirely surprising, but it's definitely something to note.
Yeah. Definitely.
About the, kind of the origins of some of this stuff.
Yeah. And speaking of origins, so Page's web crawler, it started its work in March of 96.
96, yeah.
And it actually started by crawling his own Stanford homepage.
Oh, that's cool. So very, very humble beginnings.
Yeah, so it's gathering all this link data, right?
Right.
But, how do you make sense of that data? How do you actually, use it to make something meaningful?
Right.
And this is where PageRank comes in.
PageRank.
Yeah, so to measure the importance of those backlinks, Brin and Page developed this algorithm called PageRank.
Okay.
And they realized that a search engine based on PageRank would be way better than the existing search engines at the time.
Right.
Which were mainly just counting keywords.
Right.
Like how many times a word appears on a page.
Right.
And so, it's not just about finding the pages that mentioned your search term.
Right.
It's about finding the most authoritative, the most important, the most relevant pages.
So PageRank is really about taking into account the structure of the web itself, the the links, the connections between things to say, okay, if a lot of websites link to this particular website, that probably means it's a good website. It's a website that other people trust. It's a website that's, got some good information on it.
Yeah. And it's almost like the web itself is kind of vouching for that page.
Exactly. Oh.
And the results were pretty impressive.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So the first version of what would eventually become a Google launched in August of 96, right there on the Stanford website.
Okay.
And it was such a data-intensive operation that it used up almost half of Stanford's network bandwidth.
Wow, that's pretty amazing for the time. That's a lot of data.
Yeah, yeah.
It was a big deal.
And by the end of August of that year, they had indexed over 75 million HTML URLs and downloaded something like 207 gigabytes of content.
Okay, so we're talking a lot of data here.
Yeah.
And they were doing this on, by today's standards, pretty basic hardware.
Yeah.
They were using, Java and Python, Sun Ultra, Intel Pentium computers running Linux. The primary database was on a Sun Ultra 2.5 with 28 gigabytes of disk space.
Yeah, and it's interesting because PageRank, although it was this groundbreaking innovation, it wasn't completely out of the blue.
Oh, okay.
So it was actually influenced by this algorithm called RankDex, developed by a guy named Robin Lai back in 1996.
Okay.
And in fact, in Page's 1998 patent for PageRank, he actually cited Lai's earlier work.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is that Robin Lai went on to found Baidu, the huge Chinese search engine, in 2000.
Yeah, it shows you how these ideas, kind of they float around and different people pick them up and do interesting things with them.
Yeah, it's like this cross-pollination of ideas.
Right, right.
And then, of course, there's the name itself.
Oh, yeah.
So it started as Backrub.
Backrub.
But in 1997, they switched to Google.
Google.
And this wasn't just, a random name they picked out of a hat.
Right.
It's actually a misspelling of Google.
Google.
Yeah, which is the number 1 followed by 100 zeros.
A very large number.
A massive number. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they chose this name because it symbolized the huge amount of information they were trying to organize.
It was a statement of ambition.
Yeah, it was ambitious.
So it's like, we're going to organize everything, all the information.
And actually, it's interesting because Google, the name Google had popped up a few times before.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
So like the Barney Google comic strip back in 1919.
Okay.
In Enid Blyton's books, there were some characters, Google Bun and a clown named Google in the 40s.
Interesting.
And there was even this sci-fi story from 1953 with an alien race called Googles.
Wow. So the name's been floating around for a while.
Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting how that happens, isn't it? Like
Yeah.
sometimes a name just seems to fit and it pops up in different places.
Yeah.
But this time it stuck.
This time it stuck.
Uh-huh.
And they registered the domain google.com in September of 97.
September 97.
And then Google was formally incorporated on September 4th, 1998.
Okay.
And this is where it gets kind of down to earth again.
Yeah.
So this happened in Susie Wojcicki's Menlo Park garage.
The famous garage.
Yeah.
Another tech company starting in a garage.
Yeah.
It's a classic story.
It is.
And Susan Wojcicki, of course, later became a top executive at Google and eventually the CEO of YouTube.
Yeah.
So, that garage was pretty significant
Yeah.
in the history of tech.
Yeah.
And the first Google production servers were built from, pretty cheap off-the-shelf hardware,
Yeah.
designed for fault tolerance.
Very resourceful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then there's the story of the initial funding.
Okay. The money.
Yeah.
Everybody loves a good funding story.
So the first money came in the form of a $100,000 check from Andy Bechtolsheim,
Okay.
who was a co-founder of Sun Microsystems.
Sun Microsystems. Okay.
And here's the funny thing. So he wrote the check to Google Inc.
Uh-huh.
in August of 98,
Okay.
before the company was officially incorporated.
Wow. That's faith. That's belief in the idea.
Yeah, yeah.
That's putting your money where your mouth is.
Yeah. And the check actually sat uncashed until the incorporation was finalized.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's a good story.
And then in June of 99, they had a bigger round of funding, a $25 million equity funding round.
Okay, so now we're talking real money.
Yeah, with investments from big names like Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia Capital.
Big venture capital firms.
Yeah. And even Jeff Bezos was an early investor.
Jeff Bezos. Wow.
Yeah.
So, that's a who's who of early internet investors and visionaries.
Yeah, it's like they could see the future.
Yeah, they could see where this was going.
Yeah, yeah. So with this funding, they finally moved out of the dorm rooms and the garage.
Right.
And in 1999, they set up shop at 165 University Avenue in Palo Alto.
Okay.
And then later on in 2003, they moved to this bigger complex in Mountain View, which became the Googleplex,
So Googleplex, yeah.
which they got outright in 2006 for $319 million.
So, I mean, this is a huge physical expansion. It really shows their growth, their ambition.
Yeah, yeah.
And it also marks, I think, a kind of transition from this scrappy startup phase to a more established corporate entity.
Yeah.
They're not in the garage anymore.
Right.
They're in the Googleplex.
Yeah, and here's something that might surprise you. So initially, Brin and Page were actually against advertising in search engines.
Really?
Yeah.
That's hard to believe given how much of their revenue comes from advertising now.
I know, right?
But yeah, I guess, in the early days, they were really focused on the purity of the search results.
Yeah.
They didn't want to clutter it up with ads.
Yeah, and they even wrote a paper about it in 98.
Okay.
But of course, we know they changed their minds.
They did.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess, at some point you have to pay the bills.
Yeah, get the lights on.
Yeah.
And turned out to be a pretty good move.
Oh, yeah.
So by the end of 98, Google had indexed about 60 million pages. And even though they were still in beta, Salon.com actually said their search results were better than the competition.
Wow. That's a pretty strong endorsement.
Yeah, they specifically praised their innovation compared to the overloaded portal sites that were kind of the norm at the time.
Right.
And by 99, they were processing 500,000 searches per day.
So they were growing rapidly.
Yeah.
And getting a lot of attention.
And then there's this almost unbelievable story. So in early 99, Brin and Page actually offered to sell Google to Excite.
What?
Yeah.
To Excite.
To Excite.
The search engine Excite.
Yeah.
Wow.
For $1 million.
$1 million.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pocket change for what Google is worth today.
I know, it's crazy.
That's unbelievable.
But George Bell, the CEO of Excite at the time, he turned them down.
Wow.
He said no.
I wonder what he's thinking now.
I know, right?
I mean, that's got to be one of the biggest missed opportunities in tech history.
Yeah. And get this. So Vinod Khosla, who's a venture capitalist, he actually negotiated the price down to $750,000.
Okay.
And Bell still said no.
Wow, that's hard to fathom.
I know, right?
I mean, what was he thinking?
Yeah. So Google continued on its own path, guided by their early mission statement, which was to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful.
It's a good mission statement.
It is.
It's simple, it's clear, it's ambitious.
Yeah.
And it's something that they've really stuck to.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways.
Yeah. But to actually achieve that mission, they needed a sustainable revenue model.
All right.
So in 2000, they started selling keyword-based text ads.
Okay, so they finally came around to the idea of advertising.
Yeah. And they were very careful to keep the page design clean and fast.
Right.
To prioritize the user experience.
Yeah, that's always been a key part of Google's philosophy.
Yeah. And this ad model was actually influenced by a company called Goto.com, which later became Overture Services.
Right.
And this actually led to a patent infringement lawsuit.
Ooh.
Which Google settled by issuing stock to Yahoo.
Yahoo.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, I mean, there's a lot of legal wrangling going on behind the scenes, even in those early days.
Yeah. And speaking of guiding principles, so Google's famous code of conduct, Don't Be Evil, was actually included in their IPO prospectus in 2004.
Don't be evil.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a famous phrase.
Yeah.
And it's one that, has been debated a lot.
Yeah.
But certainly it captured a kind of ethos that they were trying to project.
Yeah. And then the 2000s was this decade of incredible product expansion.
Oh, yeah.
So they launched Google News in 2002.
Okay.
They acquired Blogger in 2003.
Blogger.
Yeah. And then Gmail in 2004.
Gmail, the email service that changed everything. I mean, I remember when Gmail came out.
Yeah. And everyone thought it was an April Fool's joke.
It was like gigabytes of storage.
Yeah.
Are you kidding me?
I know, right?
This is amazing.
It was huge.
Yeah.
And then Google Maps in 2005.
Google Maps, yeah.
YouTube in 2006, which they bought for $1.65 billion.
Wow.
And the deal was reportedly finalized at a Denny's.
At Denny's. That's amazing. I love that story.
Yeah.
And then Google Chrome, the browser, launched in 2008.
Yeah.
And Google Voice in 2009.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, they were just launching product after product.
Yeah, it was just this constant, like, expansion.
Yeah.
And it all culminated in their IPO on August 19th, 2004.
The IPO?
Yeah, they offered over 19 million shares at $85 each, raised $1.67 billion, and the company was valued at over $23 billion.
So this is a huge event.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a moment when Google really becomes, you know, a public company.
Yeah, yeah.
And a major player in the stock market.
And they did it through a Dutch auction.
A Dutch auction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the price gradually decreases until all the shares are sold.
So they're trying to be fair.
Yeah.
They're trying to make sure that everybody has a chance to get in on this.
Yeah, yeah.
Not just the big institutions.
Right.
And a lot of early Google employees became instant paper millionaires.
Yeah.
Even Yahoo, which owned 2.7 million Google shares, they benefited hugely from this.
Yeah.
And then there's this interesting story. The founders and the CEO, they actually reduced their base salary to $1.
The dollar.
$1.
Yeah.
Just to show that, you know, they're not in it for the money.
Yeah, they're in it for the long haul.
Yeah. They believe in the company.
Yeah. And to kind of ensure stability and maintain their control, they also implemented this dual class stock structure.
Dual class stock.
Yeah.
So that's where you have different classes of shares with different voting rights.
Yeah. So their Class B shares had 10 votes per share compared to the Class A shares, which had 1 vote per share.
So they're basically making sure that they retain control of the company.
Yeah.
Even though it's a public company.
Yeah. And you know, the market really responded positively to all of this.
Oh, yeah.
So by June of 2005, their market cap was almost $52 billion.
Okay.
And a year after the IPO, they sold another 14,159,265 shares.
That's a very specific number.
Yeah, a reference to pi.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Google loves their little jokes, their little Easter eggs.
They do.
Yeah.
But with all this success came increased competition.
Right.
So companies like Microsoft, you know, started to challenge them in areas like search, webmail, and local search.
Right.
So Bing versus Google Search, Hotmail versus Gmail.
Yeah.
And Google actually developed Chrome OS to compete with Windows.
Okay.
And they launched the Chrome browser.
Right.
And there was even a legal dispute when a former Microsoft executive, Kai-Fu Lee, joined Google.
Okay.
Which was eventually settled out of court.
So, I mean, things are getting heated. Yeah. You know, the competition is really heating up.
Yeah, yeah. And on top of that, they also started to see the threat of click fraud.
Click fraud.
Yeah.
So that's where people are, you know, artificially inflating the number of clicks on ads.
Yeah.
To drive up costs.
Yeah. And their CFO in 2004 actually identified this as a major threat to their business model.
Okay. Yeah.
And they also started to look beyond the digital world.
Okay.
So they experimented with radio advertising, acquired DMark in 2006.
Okay.
And they even tested ads in print publications like the Chicago Sun-Times.
Interesting. So they're not just a digital company.
Yeah.
They're looking at all sorts of different ways to reach people,
Yeah.
to advertise, to get their message out.
And their philosophy, as stated by Eric Schmidt in 2005, was to really focus on solving new problems and creating new markets.
Right. Not just copying what other people are doing.
Yeah, yeah. And this really paid off. So in March of 2006, they were added to the S&P 500.
The S&P 500, that's a big
Yeah.
deal. That's a sign that you've really made it.
Yeah.
You know, as a company.
Yeah, yeah. But they didn't always get it right.
Oh.
So in 2008, they launched Knoll.
No.
Yeah.
Which was?
Which was supposed to be a Wikipedia competitor.
Oh, yeah.
But it failed, and they shut it down in 2012.
Okay. So, I mean, not everything they touch turns to gold.
Right.
They're not infallible.
No. And then there's the whole issue of user data and tracking.
Right.
So although they had been primarily ad funded since the IPO,
Yeah.
they didn't actually start using cookie-based web tracking until 2007.
Okay.
And this was when they acquired DoubleClick for $3.1 billion.
DoubleClick. That was a
Okay.
big acquisition.
Yeah.
And it really changed the game in terms of how Google collected data
Yeah.
and how they used that data for advertising.
Yep.
And it's interesting because revenue from display ads was actually declining before this acquisition.
Okay.
So they needed to do something.
Yeah.
They needed to find a new way to make money.
Yeah. And then in 2016, they actually removed the separation between ad tracking data and other service data.
Okay, so now they're basically tracking everything you do.
Yeah.
Across all of their services.
Yeah. And this, of course, has led to a lot of privacy concerns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a trade-off.
Yeah.
You know, you get all these great free services from Google,
Yeah.
but they're collecting a lot of data on you.
Yeah.
And they're using that data to target you with ads.
Yeah. And they also made several attempts to get into social networking.
Oh, yeah.
Google Buzz, Google Friend Connect, or Cut, Google Plus.
Google Plus.
Yeah.
That was their big attempt to take on Facebook.
Yeah.
But it didn't really work out. They
Yeah.
shut it down in 2019.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they haven't been successful in every area.
No. But their global presence continued to grow.
Oh, yeah.
So by November of 2014, they had over 70 offices in over 41 countries.
Okay.
And then in 2015, there was this major restructuring.
Restructure.
Yeah. So Google became a subsidiary of this new holding company called Alphabet Inc.
Alphabet.
Yeah.
So this was their way of kind of separating their core businesses from their more experimental moonshot projects.
Yeah.
Things like self-driving cars, life sciences,
Yeah.
you know, stuff that's not really related to their core search and advertising business.
And then in 2017, Google Inc. became Google LLC, a subsidiary of x66 Holdings Inc., which itself is a subsidiary of Alphabet.
Okay, so it's getting complicated.
Yeah.
The corporate structure is getting very complicated.
Yeah, it's like a Russian doll situation.
Right, right.
And then from 2018 to 2019, there were these growing internal tensions.
Oh, yeah.
So protests over sexual harassment, the censored Chinese search engine Dragonfly, the military AI project Maven.
Right.
And Google actually reported firing 48 employees for sexual misconduct over 2 years.
Okay.
And Sundar Pichai, the CEO, he actually supported the employee protests. So, I mean, there's this kind of this tension between, you know, the corporate power of Google and the ethics of some of their projects.
Right. And I think that's something that they're still grappling with.
Yeah. And then in March of 2019, they announced Google Stadia.
Stadia?
Yeah, their cloud gaming platform.
Okay.
But also, in June of 2019, the Department of Justice announced an antitrust investigation into Google.
Okay, so the regulators are starting to pay attention
Yeah.
to Google's power.
Yeah, and this actually led to a lawsuit in October of 2020 alleging monopoly abuse in search and search advertising.
Okay.
And then in December of 2019, they brought in Bill Reddy as their commerce chief.
Bill Reddy.
Yeah, the former COO of PayPal.
Okay.
And this was actually separate from Google Pay.
Okay, so they're really serious about commerce.
Both